Let's start for the second panel of this conference. In this conference, we'll be talking about conceptual issues on development aid. It also relates to the main theme of the conference, which is conceptual transformation or sort of changing nature of development aid from past to future. In the first session it was more about institutional country perspective. Now we want to go more deeper on theoretical dimensions. That's why we have more academics in this panel, and hopefully each of them will be contributing to debate at great level. I kindly ask each of the speakers to limit their presentation like 13 minutes. If I were generous, I would give another 2 minutes perhaps. Then 13, 15 minutes, that would be much, much better. Then we can have a time for discussion and question and comments. Let's start with the order. We have SETA Economy Director, Professor Sadık ÜNAY. He will be going first. Professor, floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank TICA and our institution, SETA, and our director for organizing this conference. I think it's quite a timely event. And in Turkey now, foreign aid and development cooperation has been occupying the agenda of policymakers increasingly over the course of last years, we need to say. Turkey has been transformed from a recipient of foreign aid to a major donor. And in the morning we listened to the Deputy Prime Minister and the head of TICA talking about the details of this transformation. And in this panel we will look at conceptual issues. How can we conceptualize the global order? I will talk about the changes in global order, and I will try to link these changes, these shifts, to the changing nature of foreign aid and development cooperation. And we have valuable participants, panelists, and as the host, I will give maybe some of my time to them. I mean, we want to kind of hear their valuable ideas. But as a general framework, maybe we need to talk about the shift of global, maybe the epicenter of politics. People talk about various forms of global shift. Peter Dicken wrote a book on the global shift in the early 2000s. But after that, it increasingly came to the agenda of political science, economy. I'm a political economist, and I constantly listen to people talking about a global shift. For example, most recently, I was working on a study on China and the emergence of East Asia as a kind of power block, so to speak. And many, for example, political scientists, development economists, for example, especially the American tradition, they talk about the shift from the Atlantic axis to the maybe East Asian axis. We have important guests from Korea. The deputy president of KOICA is here, and we have representatives from JICA as well. So when we look at the transformation trajectory in East Asia, the increasing intensity of foreign aid and development cooperation has been an ingredient, a crucial ingredient of emerging powers. So the emerging power status of a country generally implies that you have a vibrant economy, you have a vibrant private sector and NGOs and aid institutions, and you build your political and economic capacity to reflect that domestic transformation to the first regional and then global order. So I think when we look at the transformation, I will use Turkey's case as a case study here, but I can see the same pattern when I look at the transformation in Turkey's foreign aid and development cooperation. Traditionally, as I say, during the Cold War years, Turkey was a net recipient of foreign aid. And we looked at, in the Cold War environment, we looked at the foreign aid, especially military aid, coming from the US and NATO alliance as a key kind of concept, as a key instrument that linked us to the Western world, the free world, so to speak. So it was a guarantee in that respect for maintaining cordial diplomatic and political relations as well. But especially after the end of the Cold War, this picture started to change, and the first challenge for the Turkish policymakers was the dissolution of the Soviet Empire and how to approach especially the Turkic states in Central Asia. So foreign aid became, it is not a coincidence that the development of TICA kind of gained speed after that, because it was the first major policy challenge that Turkey had to reply and to provide some form of technical aid in terms of material support, education support, health support, and these aspects of soft power, which we use a lot these days in foreign policy. First, to Central Asia, the Balkans, Caucasia, which were seen as the natural kind of habitat of Turkey, natural immediate neighborhood of Turkey. So it started from there during the 1990s, and there was kind of a sporadic growth over the course of 1990s. It depended largely on the domestic kind of political and economic stability, because during 1990s, Turkey went through difficult periods. There were coalition governments, there were up and downs in the economy, and the dynamism in foreign aid and development cooperation is closely linked with your domestic economic dynamism. If you have sustainable growth, if you have a foreign trade surplus, for example, if you have dynamic foreign investors, if you have a strong Exim Bank, for example, who can provide credit, in return your private sector can go into new markets, then you can have a say in the global foreign aid market, so to speak. Yeah? So if you look at Turkey's transformation over the course of 1990s, I think it was a slow process because it was interrupted by financial crises in 1994, 1999, 2000, 2001. But once domestic stability was achieved after 2002, and I think that is a credit of the existing kind of government or series of governments, single-party governments, that domestic stability was successfully reflected into success in terms of extending foreign aid. In the morning, we have seen the numbers and figures, for example, that Turkey's foreign aid budget started from, I think, $61 million and went to over $3 billion. It still continues to expand, but the geographic scope as well, which started from the Balkans, the Central Asia, Caucasia, in which you can find ethnic or cultural proximity to the Turkish kind of nation. It started from there because, as I say, these were seen as the natural habitat, which is, for example, similar to South Korea, providing most of the, for example, foreign aid to East Asian region, for example, or Poland, providing most of the foreign aid to Eastern European or Baltic states, for example. So for many emerging powers or developing countries, we can say, the first instinct, the natural instinct of many countries is to start from the region that you see immediately around you in terms of history, politics, culture, and so on, and focus on your foreign aid activity as a geographic proximity. But as you develop economically as a major power, that is like the emerging power status. When you begin to kind of earn that status, which is similar to countries, the BRICS countries, for example, we can see Brazil, Russia, India, China. I mean, these are the Mint countries, the second generation emerging powers. When you start to kind of project your regional status to a global kind of actor, then your foreign aid perspective also widens. So we see the same kind of attitude in the transformation of Turkey's foreign aid, maybe attitude. For example, if you look at the countries that receive the most of Turkey's foreign aid budget these days. For example, Afghanistan. Okay, it is close to Central Asia, but normally it is not within the kind of community of Turkic-speaking kind of nations. Afghanistan takes quite a lot from Turkey's aid budget. Somalia, for example. Yemen. Yeah? These are countries in which, okay, you have some form of maybe cultural link, but these countries are in strong need of reconstruction. So these are countries that also need massive amounts of infrastructure investment. So Turkey focused its efforts, if I may say, onto those countries who are starting from scratch. Like Somalia, I mean, you don't even have an airport in which some statesman can come and land, for example. When Tayyip Erdogan was prime minister, he went there with a delegation and they had great difficulty in landing because there was no airport, no proper airport. I mean, now there is, for example. So Turkey made massive investment into Somalia, and Somalia is now given as an example of the Turkish model, in which you don't have many kind of bureaucratic wrangling like the UN system, for example. There is no delays or the reductions in the budgetary framework, which is more direct, which is more informal, which is more speedy, and you have more human kind of input in that, for example. So maybe we might talk about different models, but people began to speak about the Turkish model after Somalia, especially. In Yemen, the same. In Afghanistan, you can see a similar perspective. For example, I think there was a quote from the Prime Minister of Somalia. He was saying, if we require, for example, computers from a UN institution or an international institution, it will take maybe 2 years to arrive. And the number will be half or maybe 1/3 of what we require. But if we kind of demand it from Turkey, they will be here next week. So, I mean, there was a kind of different attitude to speed up the process. And in development issues, this speed is very important. And also human-to-human contact, trying to understand the real needs and to have a demand-based approach to foreign aid as well. What are those demands? Because in some countries, in some countries we see that there are different criteria. For example, following the EU example, for example, you have a certain criteria in your mind. Okay, I want to kind of promote democracy, human rights, whatever. I mean, it might be political criteria, other criteria, but applying them might be having an effect that limits your options, and that might have an impact on limiting the interaction between those who are in real need of development aid and yourself. So I think especially in countries in dire need of development assistance, adopting a need-based approach might be better fitting in taking speedy outcomes. And Turkey is trying to follow that. And I think in that respect, foreign aid is quite an important ingredient of foreign policy openings in many different regions, in many different human-based kind of enterprises, I will say, initiatives, so that the profile of the country, I mean, that reaches to a global level. And after that, I think there is no return. I mean, once you speak, once you kind of make investments, once you become a partner, for example, Somalia normally has we are giving it as an example, but TICA has many offices in Africa. They follow the openings of the Turkish diplomatic community, and they are opening now offices in Latin America as well. I talked to the TICA president. He was talking about that they were about to open an office in Mexico. For example, if you consider this, like 20 years ago, I mean, opening a foreign aid or development cooperation office in Mexico would be unthinkable for Turkey, because the scope of foreign policy, it was quite narrow. So it was like a narrow circle around Turkey's geographical proximity. Now it is, we can say, practically it's the globe. And for many emerging powers, I think, like Turkey, foreign aid and development cooperation is both an instrument that supports foreign aid, but it has also concrete aids, concrete support for the people on the ground. So, but once you get kind of in those global networks after a while, I mean, it becomes maybe impossible to go back, because you form a lot of connections, you form a lot of links, you form institutions, you form schools, hospitals, and so on. After a while, it takes a life of its own, those foreign policy, foreign aid initiatives. And I think Turkey's experience in the last decade constitutes a crucial example in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ünay, for bringing Turkish experience to the discussion. I'm sure it will provoke many issues after presentations. Now we have a second speaker, Dr. Shabbir CHEEMA, if I'm pronouncing correctly. He came all the way from Hawaii, and he has an experience in both international institution and now he's back to working environment. Dr. CHEEMA, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And very good afternoon. And I bring a very warm aloha from the beautiful islands of Hawaii. And aloha means love, welcome, care, goodbye. Everything combined into one. I think it's closest to Assalamu Alaikum that we can ever have. I think the Honorable Deputy Prime Minister made a strong statement that whatever happened in the past, let's think about the paradigm of the future as far as development aid is concerned. I think before we can come to the paradigm and the issues engaged in that process, we should use the words and the concept in a right way. I was for 20 years senior staff of UNDP, and one day I saw the light and I became an academic at the East West Center. And I feel that there's a need for clarity, the way we use concept and categories and words, such as development aid, development assistance, ODA, the overseas official flows, etc. These are to be clarified. Why are they important? They're important because when you do the surveys of different countries, that will show that the country X is providing that much support to a recipient country. But reality is totally different, because country X may be providing concessional loans, but country B may be providing 60% grant funding. So these categories are different, and therefore in our generalizations, and that's the academic in me speaking, we are to specify the context within which we are talking about. So in 10 minutes that I have, I would like to make 5 points, which I think are key issues in the delineation of a new paradigm of development assistance. I can talk much longer, but I think I can convey those 5 points. The first point is that, as was mentioned briefly in the morning, post-2015 development agenda is really, at the global level, the new game in town. If we are serious about new paradigm for development support, we got to look at the requirements of post-15 development agenda, which of course is a consensus of all the countries in the world. Now, ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, was initially developed by DAC, and it allows the climate-related intervention to be counted as development aid. A lot of us question that, because investment in climate support is a mutual investment for all the countries involved. One can disagree with that, but that issue needs to be recognized. Also, post-2015 development agenda, we need to recognize how much international public finance for sustainable development is needed in each of these areas, which is ODA, climate finance, etc. And because that needs to be determined, and there are methodologies and approaches being developed at the UN as well as OECD for that purpose. Also, within the post-2015 development agenda, we got to pay attention to what I call quality and quantity of development assistance. What do I know about, mean by quality? I think quality is very important for sustainable development, for any categories of development. And in that sense, the good news is that OECD-led initiative on aid effectiveness has been one of the very good ideas that will contribute to the emergence of this new paradigm, especially the global partnership for effective development cooperation that has emerged. But at the same time, quality is important, but quantity matters too. If the developed countries had committed to increase their contribution to 0.7%, but that's not a reality. Even today, the development support from donor Arab countries is 5 times more than average of OECD countries' development assistance. So that's the reality. So quantity matters because we cannot keep on expanding the global agenda but not putting resources to meet that agenda. So in that sense, this is the second point that I would like to raise is the amount of development assistance being provided by non-DAC donors has increased significantly. It was mentioned in the morning session, how much are the estimates of that, and also the role of BRICS and emerging powers such as Turkey was listed. I'll just give you only one example. At the ISA Center, we focus a lot on East Asia. China today is the story. Many of you might have read that just yesterday or day before yesterday, the 4 largest European powers agreed to co-sponsor the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, sponsored to be based in Shanghai and sponsored by China. That is a critical demonstration of how the global economic architecture has changed. People increasingly look to, a lot of countries increasingly look to countries such as China as the major source, not necessarily of grant assistance, but major source for investment, financing, cooperation. And the difference between the Chinese assistance and many of the Western countries' assistance is A, no conditionality, B, no requirement for democracy promotion agenda or a lot of time human rights promotion agenda, and C, a partnership approach where focusing on the productive sector. And I was pleased to learn that a lot of these elements are present in the Turkish development cooperation as well. But the scale is huge. So in that sense, the post-2015 development agenda, we have to discuss these issues much more clearly. In addition to traditional grant aids, the lines of credit, concession loans, trade, investment, and technical cooperation, sometimes the boundaries between these instruments of development assistance are gray. There are gray areas, yet there are countries who would rather like to have trade instead of traditional aid. Yet it becomes extremely difficult I know a few countries that have banged on the door of the Western countries to open up their imports to textile. And those countries are getting billions of dollars in foreign aid, but that trade issue is still closed. So that's a new reality from the recipient country's perspective that needs to be recognized. The third point that I like to make is that transparency of development assistance is important both for donors and recipients, and I must appreciate a very important role that OECD DAC is playing in that, and I think the need is even for the non-DAC donors to get engaged in that and be more transparent at a global level in who are they supporting, what is the criteria, so that we at the global level we have a clear picture of what is going on. Because we know today that there are three models which are emerging of development cooperation. OECD DAC model, that we talk about it, the Arab model, and Southern model, which is the newly emerging power, such as China, India, Brazil, and Turkey. Now, at the end of the day, the countries themselves should have the capacity to combine these different modalities to suit their own situation. There's no one model fits all. And that, from the recipient country's perspective, is a good news. The fourth point that I like to raise is how to improve. This is an old issue, but trust me, it's going to be much more important than it was in the past. And the issue is how to improve coordination and government ownership of development support, development cooperation. United Nations Development Cooperation Forum has the potential to become an independent body to go beyond DAC, the Arab model, and Southern models. We created the United Nations. Let it make work for us instead of the different groups going in different directions with different criteria. Surely, DAC should be one set of that cooperation mechanism, but at the end of the day, it's the UN that becomes very important. On the same issue, I think one very important point is that of the national ownership. As a political scientist, I believe that proliferation of donors and proliferation of agencies and proliferation of development donor-supported development project had led to dismantling, weakening of national institutional capacities. Each of the donors having different reporting requirement, different criteria for funding. So the transaction cost on the developing countries and the recipient countries for this kind of support is very, very high. I've been in the UNDP as the Director of Governance in UNDP. I have gone, look up close and personal in the developing countries. I'm an academic now. And I know that if you look from a holistic perspective, the developing countries are getting the wrong end of the deal when his national ownership is concerned. In fact, the developing countries are losing their capacity to respond to pressure. My final point that I would like to make is that a significant shift has taken place from multilateralism to bilateralism. I know why most donors still prefer to use bilateral rather than the multilateral aid to ensure their greater control over how and where the resources go. But the impact of the multiplicity of these actors, the high transaction costs in the developing countries is such that in the post-2015 development agenda, we have to revisit it. To conclude, the issues are many. The agenda is very broad. We are going in the right direction, but we've got a lot of work to do, both in terms of conceptual clarity and policy commitment. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. CHEEMA, thank you very much. Now, without spending time, I just want to go to third speaker, Dr. Janaka JAYAWICKRAMA. Janaka, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm from the Post-War Reconstruction and Development Unit in the University of York in the UK. And personally, I'm Sri Lankan, and I have been working in disaster development and uneven development affected communities in Asia and Africa, as well as in the Middle East for about last 20 years. So I'm going to talk from my experience, and also as a teacher, I'm putting some ideas to you. So if you get angry, if you want to argue with me, that's my goal. The most interesting aspect from this conference is because also I'm an advisor to the World Humanitarian Summit, so I was going to visit Turkey next year, but then thanks to TICA and SETA and also the government of Turkey, I'm here. So looking at the conceptual issues in development aid, I would like to draw few points from the past and invite everybody to think about future. It's a very interesting, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, development aid didn't associate it with human rights. Although we had the Universal Declaration for Human Rights from 1945, we didn't even establish a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights till 1992. I'm not going to talk about the politics there. However, since 1990, world started changing rapidly. The first milestone is 1994 Rwanda, where the international community watched about 1 million people getting killed within a month. We didn't do anything. So that was a big problem. And then happened the 2001 September 11 attack. So both those incidents, keeping them as reference points, changed the world immensely. If you look at today, large portions of the Western development and humanitarian aid goes to the Muslim world. And we don't think about the social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental implications of that. And then also we talk about evaluations, best practices, good practices, all of that. But what do we learn? So in that changing situation, the European and North American hegemony, especially talking from a humanitarian perspective, is changing. In 2014, the EU and US contribution to the humanitarian aid was 30%, which is less than 10% of their contribution from 2013. So that means, again, the emerging donors have the opportunity to change the world, think about and rethink about development as a concept, but also how do we deliver development aid at community level for poor. So basically what I'm talking about, people, pro-poor development. Because at the end of the day, we can sit in these nice rooms, talk about all of that, but Abdullah in Somalia or John in Malawi is still suffering. And that's what we need to think about. And in this world today, we have to realize both the mainstream development approaches have failed. The neoclassical capitalism model, as we heard from the former foreign minister from Portugal, is all falling down. And we know what happened to Marxism. So there is an opportunity to think about new alternative development model. Because if you look at from a developing world point of view, poor point of view, they've been told by the visiting academics, visiting experts. As a Sri Lankan, I would call them 2 weeks experts to countries. Come and talk about, tell people how to live their lives, tell people how to develop. And I think this is an opportunity for the emerging donors to think about, how do we do this? What are the alternative solutions to this paradigm that we need to start with the homegrown idea with a firm base to the roots of community. So based on that, there are 3 points I would like to mention here. The first point is that a large number of poor in the global south and the complex problems related to poverty, which includes disasters and conflicts, and also climate change now, puts equality and communities at risk. There is no political equality unless there is civil equality. The second point is the conventional development strategies with predetermined objectives have been inadequate and have not been able to capture the real felt needs of the poor. The state's role as the centralized provider has to be changed to the facilitator, to the enabler and supporter of communities to develop themselves. And in order to eradicate poverty, there is a need for a major political approach in which social mobilization and empowerment of the poor plays a critical role. When the poor participate as subjects, not as objects, in the process of development, they are enabled to generate additional growth in a development perspective. So keeping in that in mind, there are 5 key points to think about for future. How do we actually think about development as a concept, but also how do we look at development aid as a process of enabling poor people? The first one is social transformation, a structural and transformative change that is rooted in the people and incorporates the whole society. So we are not necessarily talking about the agenda of the development aid agency, but the community themselves, their culture, their traditional knowledge systems needs to be incorporated. Perspectives and values, the second point. We have to go back to fundamental values in traditional societies and examine these values in the context of poverty alleviation today in order to understand the contradictions, observe the changes, and learn the lessons from some of the wider development values. When I say wider development values, we need, if we talk about the European North American hegemony as a predominantly a Christian idea, why not think about Islamic ideas? Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and so on needs to be thought through, especially in an African context. How do you bring your dead ancestors into your development process? Needs to be thought through. And then the third point is countervailing power, a political approach to the transition. There is a need for the devolution of power and empowerment of the poor in order to achieve participatory development. Only through sharing of power can the poor also share the resources. And the decision of sharing power has to be political one. Fourth one is growth, human development, and equity has to come together. There are no trade-offs in that process. The development process is seen mainly as an economic growth or an economic exercise driven by the industrial countries both in West and the East. But sustainable development strategies need to search for alternative driving forces for self-sustaining processes. There is also a need to adopt more complex strategies that combines human development, growth, equity, and technological changes with a wiser and more creative use of local resources and knowledge. Because at the end of the day, people in disaster, conflict, and uneven development affected countries, that's their lives. So it's important that they have that ownership. And finally, refocusing practice and participation. Knowledge can be used to reinforce good governance. The traditional knowledge systems needs to inform the whole process, and stimulation in the form of an animator is needed to bring out creativity, self-reliance, and self-involvement in the processes. So in order to establish a new development paradigm and development aid discourse, there is a need to build a new school of thought based on these 5 fundamentals that are accepted by the politicians, policymakers, and practitioners alike, and link to the mobilization of people and the lessons learned from the grassroots experiments, especially from the global south. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janaka. Now we have another speaker from Colombia and France, actually, Dr. Isalina BERGAMASCHI. Floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Los Andes in Bogota. And I would like to thank SETA and TICA for inviting me to this event. My presentation today is a presentation of an academic article that I've submitted to the journal called Third World Quarterly, and the title of the presentation is The DAC and the South, a Failed Encounter with an interrogation point, Strategies and Patterns of Association and Participation. It raises 2 main questions. How do countries of the Global South take part in existing multilateral organizations and processes? And also, how can the aid global governance and architecture take better into account the interests and agendas of the countries of the Global South. So the case study is really the OECD DAC, the Development Assistance Committee of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The presentation is based on interviews that I did with representatives of non-member countries of the South, and also OECD staff and DAC delegates between 2011 and 2014. So as you know, the OECD is a multilateral but selective international organization, and well, it traditionally only included northern or industrialized or developed countries, and so did most of its committees, but in the, well, as of the year 2000s, the organization has tried to increase its outreach towards non-member countries and countries of the South, and so has the Development Assistance Committee. So what I'm trying to do in the paper is to explain how this was done in practice, and also what the outcomes of this process have been. So the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness and Harmonization that was adopted at the OECD DAC in 2005 was very much a European donor thing. So countries of the South were not fully involved in the process of the drafting of the declaration and the process of its adoption. However, after the adoption of the declaration, for many reasons, recipient countries in particular have been associated to the implementation and the evaluation of the Paris Declaration at the country level, but they were also invited to participate in the discussions related to aid effectiveness at the OECD DAC. They were able to participate in the task teams and the clusters and the building blocks who contributed to the preparation of the 4th high-level meeting on aid effectiveness in Busan in 2011. And they were able to participate as well as members of a partner country caucus that was created especially for their participation within DAC spaces. So there were a few institutional innovations for the OECD DAC in order to better include non-member countries of the Global South. The reasons for this are both practical. Most of the aspects included in the Paris Declaration can only be implemented at the country level, and so it made no sense not to include these countries. Also, it's important to underline that the DAC has a tradition of working with non-member countries since its creation. The reason for that was traditionally a concern for burden sharing, sharing the burden of foreign aid, trying to associate more partners, even if they are not DAC members. And in the year 2000s, very clearly, there was also a concern regarding efficiency and legitimacy. With the rising role of emerging donors or non-traditional or non-DAC donors, it made no sense for the OECD to keep working on building international global norms regarding aid efficiency without trying to associate these countries and without trying to well, publicize their norms towards these donors. It was also a matter of legitimacy for them to show that they were able to adapt their traditional identity and mandate to the new Another point that is important here is that the efforts just after the adoption of the Paris Declaration were geared toward aid recipients. Most of them least developed countries who receive foreign aid or sometimes are dependent on this aid. And it's interesting to note that as of, I don't know, 2009, 2010 maybe, these efforts made by the DAC were increasingly geared towards the BRICS, the emerging countries included in this coalition. Trying to promote the DAC norms to these donors because they represent an increasing volume in the global share of foreign aid. In the paper, I try to draw a typology of the different postures, positions, and strategies that were developed by non-member countries of the Global South within the space of the OECD DAC. Trying to focus on the agency of these southern countries. How did they seize the new opportunities that the DAC offered when they opened their doors? What was clear in the process is that, well, I tried to distinguish between three categories of countries. The first one would be the partners with goodwill. In this category, I included countries like Mali and Ghana. All the countries that I'm going to talk about were countries that were particularly active in the process while I was doing my field observation at the OECD DAC. So Mali and Ghana, but Honduras could also be included. And for this country, what really mattered was the implementation of the Paris Declaration. These countries did not necessarily want to broaden the negotiation agenda. They wanted the Paris Declaration to be adopted because there's a paradox with the Paris Declaration. Its drafting did not include southern countries, but there's a lot of benefits for aid recipient countries in the Paris Declaration, especially if you look at the issue of mutual accountability, if you look at the issue of predictability and the central notion of ownership, which has been interpreted by many southern governments as an equivalent for sovereignty, which in the text it is not really, but if you look at it from a special perspective, you can use it in a more political way to make a point towards your donors at the country level. So these countries were, to a certain extent, in favor of the status quo. Just implement what there is in the Paris Declaration, and then it will be fine. So use of country systems, aid predictability, ownership, donor harmonization, the reduction of transaction costs, etc. There was another opposite category to the partners with goodwill, and they were the BRICS, well, excluding Russia for that purpose, because we're only talking about emerging donors of the Global South. So they were increasingly the targets of the OECD DAC and some of its member countries because of the volume of aid that they represent. But they were well, in the paper, I call them the unwilling partners, because they were always reluctant to fully take part in the DAC discussions, and especially to endorse the principles and norms and targets and objectives and commitments that are included in the aid efficiency agenda, Paris Declaration, and what followed until, well, the first meeting of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation in Mexico in 2014. So they always insisted on the specificity of their aid and on the voluntary participation of their governments in those processes and their voluntary implementation of the principles of the aid agenda, of the aid efficiency agenda. The reluctance of these emerging donors explain that the efforts made by the DAC were a partial failure, in the sense that they never really managed to fully associate these emerging donors, but it does not mean that it was a total failure. Regarding the first category, there was a full appropriation or ownership of the Paris Declaration for the aid recipient countries. It's interesting to see that, for example, when there was a very deep political crisis in Mali in 2012 and 2013, some members of the government actually used the Paris Declaration in order to try to tame the military junta that was in power for a very brief period, and more globally regarding the transition government, to say we need to make a savvy use of aid. We need to respect the procedures. We need to follow the Paris Declaration principles. So they really appreciated the space that was opened by the DAC, and they really embraced the principles included in the Paris Declaration. That was not so much the case with the emerging donors, but the space that countries like Brazil or India or South Africa let open, or China as well, because they did not seize all the opportunities. You see that another category of countries actually got involved and seized these opportunities. And so I call them the bold partners pushing for change. And in this category, I include countries like Colombia and Rwanda. So Rwanda very much defended the same agenda as the recipient countries, but in a very assertive way, much more assertive than the partners with goodwills like Mali and Ghana. So they were always very demanding regarding donors, pushing them on the issues of transparency, of mutual accountability, of predictability, the use of country systems, and so on. And the innovation brought around the table by Colombia was not only Colombia, together with the government of Indonesia, was the South-South Cooperation Initiative. So the idea was to bring the issue of South-South cooperation within the DAC and try to reconcile or build a bridge between South-South cooperation and traditional aid. These two countries share common characteristics that explain their involvement. They have traditionally a pro-West type of diplomacy, close relationship with the US or Europe. They both want to become emerging countries, and they both want to change their international image. If you look at the case of Rwanda, since the genocide in 1994, and if you look at the case of Colombia since the, mid-2000s, both countries have tried to renegotiate their international status by improving their image from, conflict countries, problem, from an international problem or a regional problem, to a responsible, reliable partner for the international community in the economic domain, but also in the political field. What have the outcomes of these processes been? So despite a greater inclusion within the DAC discussions regarding aid efficiency, from my observation, I could say that on the one hand, there has been a challenge of traditional categories within the DAC. So it's not so much about donors and recipients anymore. The reality is more complex. Now you have countries that are both recipients and aid providers. But what I saw as well is that there were some structural obstacles to the participation of southern countries, and that the traditional division of labor has not been completely challenged at the expense sometimes of recipient countries who are really at the bottom of the aid pyramid and architecture. So you have a greater fragmentation of the global south, but not necessarily to the benefit of recipient countries, most of them or many of them being sub-Saharan African countries. There remains a division of labor between participants, and still the tendency of traditional donors know what is good for development, and still, even in the activities that are organized by the DAC, the tendency to present representatives of southern countries as testimonies of underdevelopment rather than, producers of global norms. So it's a story of a mixed success or a mixed failure. There has been an ambiguous and incomplete institutionalization of non-member countries' participation within the DAC, including in the more recent Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Brazil, India, and China still insist on their status of observer and their voluntary participation to the monitoring exercises. The South-South cooperation agenda has lost momentum and leadership within the DAC. Many southern and emerging donors prefer to discuss these issues at the UN because they consider that it's a more representative and legitimate arena to discuss these issues. But on the other hand, it was not a complete failure for the DAC either, because you see a progressive socialization of delegates or representatives, let's say, of Brazil or China to the principles of the OECD. They start to talk about aid, and they were very reluctant to do so. China has adopted a white paper on aid, which does not respect OECD standards, but it's getting closer to that. And Brazil is talking about best practices and ownership, for example. So as a conclusion, the impact of these processes is still uncertain at the OECD DAC. It's still being defined at the moment, but it could have important consequences on the way that the committee is functioning. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Celine. Now I want to pass the floor to Professor Lichia YIU. She is the President of Center for Socio-Economic Development. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me just start out saying that it's really indeed a great honor and pleasure to be here in this very stimulating discussion forum. And I think it's really timely, and I think also the ideas that have been put forward has been very exciting and worth to pursue. Let me just sort of turn up my PowerPoint as a way to guide my discussion, because I wasn't sure how we're going to proceed. So I did prepare a fixed presentation, but I don't think it's really fitting for this context. But let me go ahead with it. I'd like to just to say a few words as a way to explain where I'm coming from and the kind of remarks that I'm making. And I think, our Center for Socio-Economic Development, although it has been in operation since 1993, but still, we remain as a niche player, as a sort of niche think tank, and we continue to do what we do best. Means that we are very agile, as well as we're trying to raise unpleasant questions, but not like very vocal NGOs advocating. We're trying to be balanced, and so we consider ourselves, as a sort of loyal critique of the current system and trying to, to improve in terms of the development results. The point I'm going to make will be the following, and based on some years of experience. And let me just sort of shortly summarize what are our experiences in actual field work in the in the country. One of our major projects was actually with China. In 1998, we started a first initiative trying to help China to build up its execution capability in order to implement the modernization policy. And was started out with the assistance of funding from UNDP, and later on taken on by the bilateral Swiss Development Corporation. And this project has been continuing until today. I want to highlight, when we talk about commitment, we're talking about time. And there is no way that we will shift our development sort of priorities and objectives when we are helping countries to go through the learning curve and also climb up if we're only talking about 1 year, 2 years. And that is one of the difficult things that we have to tackle. The second example that I want to mention is about Slovenia when it's first become independent, or even before they were going into independence. They asked us, what to do in terms of building a future state. And so we moved into a capacity building exercise, trying to help them to sort of build new institutions. They will support this nation building exercise and also to fulfill and implement acquis European. So that's a second example. I can give you some more examples if you're interested. But I would also like to say, since then, we realized from our own internal reflection, is to say that you have successful projects that actually leads to development results, but at the end of the day, the quantity is so small, and it doesn't really change what is need to happen, meaning that to bring an inclusive development process to everybody, no matter the color, place, and also socio-economic status. And so that's why we moved into sort of more doing policy studies and policy reviews. And this is also what I'm going to say today is reflect of that. Today we are part of the ECOSOC, we're part of the SDG deliberation, but we're focusing on a very small area, and I think you will find out at the end of my little input what we are focusing on. So I would just like to say that like many previous speakers already saying that we are at a very important and exciting junction of potential major change, a major transformation. SDG is a global undertaking, very bold and very complex. But if we can all embrace this goal and saying we're going to make it real, then perhaps we could also move forward and to bring stability and security and a sense of operation for most of the population. And that requires changing paradigm. So what do we mean by changing paradigm? My learned friend from UNDP gave a very good example, meaning that we do need to challenge our mindsets and also our the best practices and convictions, how things should work and would work. But focusing more on the innovation, learn from experience and try to innovate, and so that, that we could actually achieve these transformation objectives. And I want to just sort of make a short summary in terms of the experiences so far we have today and the conceptual issues related to this. And last I will say something about governance monitoring. So, defining moment. The MDG has achieved tremendous objectives, but if you unpack a little bit about the success and achievement that we have done, just taking poverty reduction as example, then by the nature of concentration of population, when you have the major actors in that category, you could achieve these objectives. But what happens to the remaining 50% that we have not been able to tackle? How about the countries who have not really fulfilled their MDG objectives? What do we do about that? So either whether we talk about MDG or talk about the future, we're confronted with old problems. And what will be the new thinking that we're going to have? And SDG, frankly, is much more complex than MDG because simultaneously, concurrently, we have to work on three objectives: economic growth, social harmony or cohesion, at the same time preserve our environment. We no longer can have the luxury in the next 15 years to sort of go sequential, and we're going to sort of make sequential targets, and so we would achieve economic growth, then we would worry about social cohesion, then we were thinking about the environment impact. Look at what China today. If you have not seen this documentary, and look at how Chinese, even the Ministry of Health is saying that by average, they lost 2 years of life expectancy per capita due to environmental pollution. So what are we thinking? How can we achieve these three objectives simultaneously? How would the weakest member of our international community actually can do this? Where would they have the resources? They were not able to provide the minimum public services to date. So we need to start thinking about our working methodologies. With all this said, if we think about the 17 targets and the 169 sub-targets, it's enormous. But now all countries, as of the 1st of January, need to translate global targets, aspiration targets into national policies and practices. While we're thinking so many countries have not been able, like my colleague here, panelists talking about the weak state and other speakers talking about weak states, lack of capacity of the public administration. How would they be able to deliver the three combined integrated development results? I don't know. And I think this is a major issue we have to address. So the paradigm shift we talked about, we acknowledge, and what we need to do now is to, like this morning the panel, one of the panelists talked about, we need to look at the history. So that's what's the history. The history so far is to say that if 60 years since Second World War, that we only have a handful of countries actually graduate, how are we going to help most of the least developed countries and some of the low-income developing countries to actually, to reach certain level, they no longer pose a global threat? I'm using this in very impolite, but if you think of the current, because of a lack of social cohesion and also lack of opportunities for individuals, we are now facing a real possibility of global instability. Right, so I think this is pretty serious. So we need to put many things under our telescope and review and reflect. Are they really fit for purpose when we set new, bold, courageous, necessary, and urgently needed global development agenda? We just listened to a very interesting, and I would like to get the paper from Isalina, is about the DAC. Yes, DAC, and also the Accra Action Agenda, and then come with Busan partnership principles. And during a very interesting global summit looking at global partnerships, which was organized by the World Bank 2 years ago, the conclusion is to say, yes, the public-private partnership will work and would work if, and that is a very important and very big if the national government actually has the capacity to manage this relationship. So I think we're coming back to a very central critical question, is how to build national capacities so that they can become impactful real partner for development dialogue and development aid relationship. Without that, I think we're still going to be missing and repeating similar difficulties. So if I can summarize, since I'm not here to just to laud development results coming from Taiwan, I would say, just like Korea, you're looking at another place that has been able to pull the bootstrap and get itself out of the really poor conditions. The thing is, the gains, the positive gains are multiple and plenty, and we have all experienced that in our lifetime for for some parts of the world. However, I would like to address the negatives as a way, sort of a loyal critique. The first thing, the negatives, is that despite we speak integration, we continue to operate in a silo and fragmented manner. We continue to compete for the market. Right? To say who is having a better idea, who has greater influence. We have not shifted into a more collaborative model, and we need to do that. Otherwise, we will pretend we are sitting on different boats. But as a matter of fact, because of the interdependency, we are, due to climate, economic system, we are on the same boat. So we have to somehow find ways to coordinate and to increase coherence. The second, there are so many black holes in this universe. When we talk about, report what you found, it's a great initiative, but not everybody, not all donors are participating in it. DAC is reporting sort of the actual development funding flow. However, we're overlooking a 2/3 of the universe, which is constitute of philanthropic actors, And these are many of the foundations, starting from the traditional foundations such as Ford foundations, end up with Bill Gates, the non-traditional. I'm getting close, right? And also, we have no idea where are the missing populations who have not been able to benefit from the MDGs. We know that, we talk a lot about sort of interstate or international disparities. But how about intrastate, intranational disparities? What is happening with this population? And our friend from York University talked a lot about that. But most critical, I think, is that we do not really have robust data to inform decision-making at different level, either global, regional, or national. And I'm also vouching for sub-national information that we need to collect in order to support strategic adaptation, which is necessary in this today's conference or context. And the governance failure. Governance failure oftentimes sort of reflect itself in terms of lack of institutional memory. We do not remember because we have difficult time to go back and to really sort of have a meta-level analysis. So since I already get a note, I will conclude my appeal. My appeal is that, can we think of a new form of global public good, which would allow the collection of data that could provide the necessary institutional memory and also allow us to sort of get down to the sub-national level, frontline services level to make better decisions. But most important, all this data is not supposed to be sort of used globally by the specialized agencies. Can we, in today's context where mobile technology, internet is so readily available, can we put these enablers into the hands of the citizen so they can start to take responsibility for what is happening to their own lives, to their own communities, so that we can start to see a momentum of sustainable development initiatives come from the communities, come from the remote areas, so they could become a responsible stakeholders capable to have a contribution to the process rather than be there if they're lucky, and at the most, they're just to be there to legitimize a process that we think stakeholder engagement are very essential. So I'm sorry for being provocative. So what I would like to say is that we have been proposing different forms of a monitoring methodology and approach, and this has been incorporated into the first prototype sustainable development report, global sustainable development report. And if you're interested, I'll be very happy to have conversation with you, and so we can take this further. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chairman, for your tolerance.
Thank you very much. I think we have 5 speakers, and all of them gave lots of thoughts for discussion and debate. If I give just a very one-line brief, Dr. Sadık ÜNAY mentioned Turkey's need-based approach. Dr. CHEEMA mentioned quality and quantity debate and whether we should focus quality or quantity in development aid. Janaka mentioned we should focus on practice and participation in development aid process. And Isalina mentioned the role of BRICS and as their unwilling partners, and Lichia ultimately mentioned inclusive process, coordination capacities, and finally, can we talk about new form of global public good, as she asked to us. So now I want to open the floor for questions and comments. I just kindly ask you to present yourself, introduce yourself, and if you also can mention whom you are asking your question, that would be very much appreciated. So floor is now open.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Hamid Azad. I'm CEO of Muslim Aid from UK. I'd like to actually disagree a little bit with Jayawickrama, I think, yeah. Because you are welcoming disagreement and thing, My disagreement is actually a little bit about, you are asking about taking a pro-poor development approach. But I think the pro-poor development approach is a bit discriminatory approach, because we don't have actually poverty of resources. I think nowadays the biggest poverty we are facing is lack of humanitarian values. Because if we had the resource lacking, then yes, we could have addressed this. Because of this, the mindset we are seeing when we are going to go poverty alleviation, it is a political agenda is overriding the poverty alleviation agenda. So this is why if we take a humanitarian development approach, I think it will solve lots of problems. And in that perspective, we need to change our mindset, I think. Number two, it is related to all the presentations, I think. It may goes to Dr. Mansoor's presentation as well. I like he actually presented 3 C's, importance of 3 C's. I would like to add 4th C, that's it, constructive intervention. Yeah, because the way world is changing, the speed of change is so huge now. I think if we could not change our approach, then we will face big problem in next 10 years or 20 years time. So I need to, instead of symptomatic approach, we need to take constructive approach to address the root causes of poverty and all the disasters. Thank you very much.
Is there any other question? We take 2 questions from behind.
Hi, I'm Aylin Yardımcı from Koç University, and my question is for Mr. Shabbir CHEEMA. You mentioned about a significant shift from multilateral to bilateral development aid, especially for the case of emerging donors. I'd like to ask what, in your opinion and experience, has been the main, what have you observed to be the main underlying factor, motivation for this shift from multilateral to bilateral aid?
Just before you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was interesting topics and discussion. My question will refer to Sadık ÜNAY. You say that Turkey is supporting more foreign aid, like providing aid to Afghanistan. And I am from Afghanistan. I'm studying economics in Istanbul University. Right now I'm working on an assignment, like the topic is foreign aid and economic growth. I am following the report that Afghanistan government is out. A report from DC, or donor cooperation report. I didn't see any development aid on budget that Turkey have provided for the government of Afghanistan. If it's off budget, I'm happy to have the data. It will be very helpful to me. And the other question is, like till 1990 or 95, the Turkey was also dependent on, very heavily dependent on aid, foreign aid and development aid. So what's the best approach that you have steps for, like you get out of the dependent from the aid, now you're a almost self-reliance economy? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Would that be fair if I give you guys, each of you, 3 minutes for responding to this question, I guess? Mr. Shabbir, we can start from you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. What are the reasons for this shift from multilateralism to bilateralism? That's the question. And the reality is that other than Nordic countries, the whole world of development community donors have already moved from multilateralism to bilateralism. Now, why has it happened? I think 3 or 4 reasons. One is political and security considerations. Let me mention to you that in 70s and 80s, 70 to 80% of United States development assistance went to 4 countries: Egypt, Israel, Pakistan, and Turkey. And aid, I mean broader category, both military assistance, grant assistance, all sort of cooperation. And at that time, lot of people questioned Americans question that there was too much focus on political consideration. But then that's an extreme example. The European donors, for them, political considerations have not been as strong, but still, nevertheless, they also have preferences for countries. So security consideration and political consideration has been one of the key factors. The second reason, and I give benefit of doubt to the donors on that, since the 1980s, there have been various UN conferences where the member states got together. So what has been happening is that the global agenda and the global norms have been changing. Gender equality, labor laws, transparency, human rights, all these are what we call global public goods. So a lot of donors, particularly European donors and the United States as well, wants to see a just, prosperous, peaceful, and equitable world. And these global values are universal values. They are in all culture, in all societies. If you really look at our culture, our society, our religion, accountability, transparency, rule of law, access, the equity, these are all basic universal values. The donors have, and of course the climate change, the donors have been putting that sometimes also as what is called quote-unquote conditionality. That was the second reason. Third reason is internal weaknesses in the global UN system. Now, I think when we say weaknesses in the UN system, we should not look at UN as an entity, independent entity that can decide whatever it wants to do. What UN does is what the member states collectively are telling UN to do. Because UN is not like an independent country, but reality still is that whenever the UN pushed for some ideas to increase from bilateralism to multilateralism, the countries which are very powerful within the United Nations, particularly Security Council, they came right back to sort of stop those initiatives. And I say that, you know, I've been privileged in my life to be able to work. I joined the UN when I was a professor. After the UN, I'm back in the academics. So I've been able to see from both sides. And I really feel that the biggest, the best news today to me is that the awareness on the part of the civil society and the citizen in the world that we want a world which is more free, more fair, more, and that is reflected in the 2015 development agenda. But then these three reasons that I gave are reasons of the past. In the future, I am very optimistic that we are moving in the right direction.
Dr. Janaka?
Okay, thank you very much. I totally agree with you. First point is that development is not a goal, it's actually a process. That's how I would say it. And then the word I use is, I agree again, like the poo-poo doesn't necessarily give you the flavor of what we're talking about, but what I meant was about communities in general. So it's about people. And when I talk about people, it's about participation of people in the development of their own lives and the empowerment. So that way people become the center of the development agenda. And yeah, I mean, again, with your whole idea of 4 Cs, it's very interesting because at the end of the day, if I talk about, like, come back to two things. Like, one, the Turkey's foreign aid policy is very, very impressive in the sense it has less invested expectations from the development aid recipients. If you look at the US foreign policy or the US development aid, it's an extension of their foreign policy. And then you look at the European Union, who doesn't have a foreign policy, use development aid or humanitarian aid as their foreign policy. So there are all these difficult issues that we are grappling with, and I've seen especially the Islamic Relief colleagues and their work in places like Somalia, where they actually look at linking humanitarian aid into long-term development, which is very, very different from the 2-year project approach to changing lives. So that's where I am. Thank you very much.
Sadık Bey.
Thank you very much. It's been a long session in the afternoon, so I'll try to keep it very short. There was one question on Afghanistan. I would like to emphasize there are some officials, our colleagues from TICA, maybe they can give you more technical information on that. But in terms of measuring foreign aid, up until 2005, there was no systematic system in Turkey. Different state institutions were giving out aid. But there was no kind of a collection of data under a central kind of mechanism. After 2005, maybe you can get more healthy kind of data, but especially on Afghanistan. Afghanistan was like a showcase kind of country, war-torn country that Turkey focused specifically after the fall of the Taliban regime. But I don't have the current figures, but I know that, for example, between 2005 and 2010, in the 5-year interval, Turkey's official development assistance to Afghanistan is around $400 million to Afghanistan only, and it was the top country which received official development assistance from Turkey. Maybe you can find, as I say, more detailed information, and in the following session maybe people will go into it. Thank you.
Is there another question? Perhaps? Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your speech. It was really a pleasure to listen to you. My name is Iva Simonovic. I'm coming from Montenegro. Now I'm on the studies of international commercial law and the EU. Actually, this year I'm in preparation course of Turkish language as a scholarship student of Turkish government. I have a question for Mr. Sadık ÜNAY. I would like to ask, as a citizen of Montenegro, does Turkey in this moment has some kind of concrete plans or projects who are looking to the Montenegro in this moment? Because we are a very small country, but very rich when it comes about energy and other stuff that is very lack and deficit in this moment in the world. And there's also a question I would like to ask you, as a country who is giving and investing a lot, do you have, and can you tell me about the concrete mechanisms of the control on the government of the country to which you gave the concrete help? How do they, what do they do with that concrete help? Do they give it in the right way to their citizens or what? Because I'm not sure that in Montenegro it's a little bit a complicated political issue, because in a lot of situations, actually the goals of the whole country and the benefits of the whole country are the same with the benefits of the ruling political party. That's why I'm asking. And people in Montenegro are generally a little bit introverts, a little bit inert, and they don't want to control by itself.
Thank you very much. Is there another question, perhaps? All right, let me just last word to Dr. Sadık, then we'll close the session.
I mean, the questions were they require quite lengthy answers. You know, it is delivering foreign aid is always a political issue, and you have some counterparts and so on. You know, maybe in the following session, maybe our officials from TICA might talk about their experiences on the ground. But as I say, it is always a challenge to find the appropriate counterpart. And in some cases, obviously, there might be competition between different groups to receive that aid, so it is a challenge to determine what is needed. That's why Turkey's general perspective has been on an need-based approach. So try to kind of determine the concrete need on the ground and make best use of the kind of facilities and the financial goals kind of you have. And on Montenegro, as I say, I think they will give you more detailed information in the following session. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. With this, I think we had an excellent panelist. I would like to thank all of them. If you have any final point on the right.
Just one small point.
Okay, please, before we close.
Yeah. One very small point is, because talking about pro-poor, and I just wanted to remind all of us, when we look at the PRSP as the most important instrument to accompany the MDG, in that we do not see anything about employment generation nor job creation. So there are many blind spots in terms of our policy choices, and I think that highlights also the importance of monitoring. Not just about the input, how much money has been flowed country A to country B, is actually how the decisions are made, how it's used, for what purpose, where, and the process related monitoring, which we consider that to be a very important part of governance. And then only that then would make sense to do evaluation. Otherwise, evaluation tends to be pro forma. It does not lead to the necessary institutional change and adaptation. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the panelists and for all of you for your patience. I think we deserve a coffee. But before we go, I think all the panelists deserve an applause. Thank you very much for your participation.